Today we are specifically going to describe non-major regular rulemaking process. This is our second module, and we will be having two more modules, and Gabby will complete this training. So thank you again for joining. Next slide. The training agenda for today includes non-major regular rule making process, notice package, modified package, final package, the administrative processes for our office and in general, and what detailed requirements are required for this specific type of rulemaking, and updates to the dashboard, and of course, your questions and comments. But feel free to send your questions in chat too. And as we process, if we can answer, that's great. But we will also answer after the presentation. Next slide, please. So you will see a couple of, for those who have attended the introductory overview session, you will see a couple of slides repeated here. This slide, we had defined what was non-major regular rulemaking in our earlier presentation too. This regulation is drafted when DTSC uses its discretion to interpret a statute. If the economic and fiscal impact is less than 50 million, and we'll go into details of this as we did in the introductory one, it does follow the Administrative Procedure Act, APA process. This regulation starts with the 45-day public notice when it is published in California Regulatory Notice Register. And the time starts once the public notice is published, and DTSC has 1 year to submit the final package to Office of Administrative Law. And we'll get into details of those in the following slides. Next slide, please. So let's go over the general process. Next slide. Again, this is the same slide we had showed in our earlier presentation. Before we begin with the drafting of regulations, there are some pre-APA processes that we do. Program, you can have your own meetings internally. You start drafting the proposal. Now, the proposal could come out of a legislative bill that becomes a law. As we said, DTSC uses its discretion. And also, there could be stakeholder meetings. There could be external interactions that you start before you draft. Obviously, when you have your stakeholder meetings, you have your workshops, you may do your surveys, and there could be direct industry meetings with program. During the APA process too, you have to do and work on your interactions, which is obviously drafting your regulations, developing responses to comments during the APA process, and if you have to modify based on the comments that you receive, and finalize the package. At that time, during the APA process, you also have external interactions. There is obviously, it starts with the public notice. There may be more than one comment period, 45-day or a 15-day comment period, and we'll go into details of that in our following slides. Obviously, external agencies like Department of Finance review your regs, and obviously OAL approves it after their review. After the regs are approved and implemented, there could be more work for you. Basically, you may have to update your guidance, or you may have to update your web pages, or there could be a training involved. External interactions would be, again, explaining the regulations after it's effective, the fact sheets that you may have to develop, or you may have to do a series of webinars to explain your regulations. Next slide, please. So this non-major regular rulemaking is completed in 3 stages. The first stage is notice package. That's when we said earlier that when it's a 45-day notice, we start the Administrative Procedure Act, and that's called as a start of the APA process. What happens during this process? It's reviewed by the peer for when it comes to our office. We review it with fiscal planning office. Obviously, the deputies review it, the director reviews, and the agency reviews. OAL pre-publication review happens before 1 year clock officially begins. And I'll go into details once we talk about notice. Also, the second stage would be during the APA process, if the package is modified, then there is a revision done to your proposed regulation within the APA process. Again, it goes through the review process, the peer and the deputies. And of course, the last stage is the final package. When all the APA process is almost completed, again, there is review by peer, deputy, director, agency, and the Department of Finance. And then OL reviews, we have to send it. The 1 year clock has to be completed when DTSC sends the package to OAL before the 1 year clock. Meaning, when you start, let's say you start your notice on March 21st, you have to make sure that you complete it before the end of March 21st, 2026. Okay, so you have to submit it. But OL can review after that 1 year clock. So they have 30 days to review. They can begin after the 21st March 2026. But for us, DTSC, we have to submit it. So this is what that last sentence means, that OL reviews after the 1 year clock officially ends. Next slide, please. So let's look at the notice package. Next slide. Notice package contains 4 templates. Notice of proposed action, economic and fiscal impact statement, initial statement of reasons, and proposed regulatory text. Next slide, please. And there could be other rulemaking documents in addition to these 4 important documents. Notice of proposed actions. It is also called as NOPA or just notice. What does it do? It announces the rulemaking and invites public to participate. It also details where to find the rulemaking documents. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, we start the public comment period, which is at least for 45 days. Next slide, please. What does it contain? It has an informative digest. It's very similar to the legislative digest. Those who work with bill analysis, your program, they know about these documents. The policy statement that overviews explaining about the regulation and the specific benefits that are anticipated by the proposal. It also has the statement of date, time, and nature of the proceeding for adoption of these regs. These have to be according to the authority and reference citation when it's proposed. So there has to be, when DTSC is authorized to develop regs, we should definitely have an authority and reference citation. Next slide, please. It also it also gives us information and evaluation of existing related state and federal laws. In this notice of proposed action, we also acknowledge what all is included. For example, CEQA analysis. So it is the California Environmental Quality Analysis, and it has to be completed But it is not a part of our rulemaking record. It has to be finalized after the rulemaking is approved by OL, and CEQA unit completes this whole document up to the submission to the clearinghouse. It also includes peer review if it has to explain some scientific and technical documents that are included, and it is a part of rulemaking record. So NOPA contains that information too. And of course, the summary and disclosure of economic and fiscal impact. That takes us to the next template that's included in this NOPA. It's economic and fiscal impact statement. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned in our overview, economic and fiscal impact statement, it describes how much is it going to cost for the regulated community, and how much is it going to cost for the state and the local authorities involved in this proposal. So the APA requires an economic and fiscal analysis, and it's prescribed by Department of Finance. The Form 399, which is giving the cost analysis, has to be signed by our Chief Financial Officer and CAL APA Secretary at the notice package stage. The Form 399, obviously, it's a form, so it has limited space. So to show our work, we have to include an attachment. But remember that Form 399 attachment is a standalone document. So we have to describe everything in it too. Next slide, please. Economic and fiscal impact statement. Let's look at the economic part. As I described, how much will it cost for the regulated entities to implement this proposal after it is approved by OL? But we also look at the other cost, meaning, the costs that are passed on to others. What effect will it have? And it is based on the information that we gather from regulated entities. If the cost is greater than 10 million, since we are a department under CalAPA, if the cost is greater than 10 million, then we require a cost benefit analysis, and we have to provide the alternatives considered, including if DTSC did nothing with this proposal. Next slide, please. For the fiscal impact, as we said, we have to see how much it's going to cost for the state and local government. So we have to look at what is DTSC's workload? How is it aligning with the legislation? If it's coming out of the legislation, then was there a budget change proposal done? So we have to align all that information. If there's going to be an enforcement for the regulation, then we have to include that too, in accordance with the compliance activities. Next slide, please. Economic and fiscal impact statement, as I said, includes attachment because the form cannot accommodate all the information and we may have to show our work. So what does the attachment, which is a standalone document, include? Summary of the proposed regulation, clear assumptions, how we explain the methodology that we are using, and of course, the data that is used to quantify it. Next slide, please. The next document that's very important is initial statement of reason. It's also called as ISOR. Now, this document describes in detail everything, how your proposal, how are you explaining? So the more you explain, the better it is. Describe the overall purpose and the necessity of proposed regulation. And it should include what's the background? How is the policy going to be explained? And obviously, why you're doing it. It's a problem, isn't it? So we are explaining the problem statement too. Next slide, please. For each of the provision that we will be explaining, we need to be very specific and in our purpose, necessity, and the benefit. So we need to explain in depth. It also explains the reasons for requiring specific technologies, equipment, or any prescriptive standards, such as any reporting methods. It should detail everything. Next slide, please. ISOR also includes all the documents that we are relying on, describes the reasonable alternatives that we are considering, describes the basis on which agency asserts there will be no significant adverse economic impact. So we are giving our explanation in addition to economic and fiscal, what will happen if. So everything. Now, for Cal EPA purposes, we want to make sure this. Remember the seven things that in our previous presentation we had talked about: necessity, no duplication, clarity, everything. We repeat that information for Cal EPA purposes, especially when we want to mention about the non-duplication or conflict with FEDS, Code of Federal Regulations, CFRs. So make sure that that's included in our ISOR. Next slide, please. So ISOR summarizes also, as we said, economic impact assessment from the Form 399. And the details are, of course, are we creating or eliminating California jobs? Are we creating or eliminating California businesses? Is there an expansion? And how is it impacting the small businesses in California? In addition to that, does it have benefit to health and welfare of California residents, worker safety, and of course, environment? So as you see, this is a very detailed document, and it's very important. Most of the people, even after the regs are implemented, look at initial statement of reasons for explanations. So we want to be very clear in this document. Next slide, please. Obviously, proposed regulatory text. It has to be very plain, straightforward, and should not use technical language. It should be understood by the regulated community, and therefore we cannot use our technical jargons. It should be very plain. We also include documents that are incorporated by reference in this text. And most important, again, the authority and reference on which we are basing this proposal. We have to remember that the proposed regulatory text, any changes to the text, if we are adding or we are changing, if we are adding, we have to show it with single underline. And if we are deleting or repelling anything, we need to show it with single strikeout. The asterisk indicates that it's an intervening text. We'll see in our later slides what happens with modified text. If it is a notice for 15-day, how do you represent that? And Gabby will be covering that. Next slide, please. Remember that when you send your documents to our office, we not only review all the documents, but we also make sure that your documents are verified with OL checklist. So we do have those OL checklists even available for your purposes also on our web page, and they are updated. Next slide, please. Keep going. Yes. So once we have all your documents, we prepare your package to go for notice. So as you can see, it depends on how long you take, but once it comes to our office for review, it's showing 11 weeks over there, 11 plus weeks, because we take at least 4 weeks with FPPI to review. Then our deputies need to review for 2 weeks. Director needs 2 weeks generally, and agency needs generally 3 weeks. After the review is completed, then we submit 10 days in advance to OL, and I'll explain it in detail in next slide. Next slide, please. So let's say we want to submit a 45-day notice, and we know OL publishes the notice each Friday. So what we do, OLRR submits the package to OL at least 10 days prior. So let's take an example. If you want your notice to be published on March 22nd, OLRR will submit the package to OL no later than Tuesday of the prior week, which is March 11th. So if you want your package to be published on March 21st of this year, next week, Tuesday, OLRR will be sending it to OL. During this 10-day period, OL reviews the documents. Now, they're not looking at the substance, they're only making sure it's compliant with publication requirements. Okay, so this is very important for you. So even if you want to publish a notice, we need extra 10 days to submit it to OAL before. So your package should be ready by Monday. Okay, next slide, please. Going. So the comment period, as we know, 45-day comment period starts. OL publishes the public notice in the register on the Friday, and at least 45 days it is in the comment period. DTSC receives these comments in writing or at a public hearing. And after that, it could vary. The time period where we say variable, it depends on how much time program takes to respond or consider and respond to your comments. And then revises based on the comments. So this is generally what happens in the comment period. Next slide. And then DTSC complies with the comments and responses, and then if there are no changes, then it moves forward. But if there are changes, then it goes through the same process, and Gabby will cover that for another notice period, comment period, which is 15 days. And we'll talk about details in the next slides. Slide. Modified package, and over to you, Gabby.
Thanks, Nina. I'm going to take this moment to reiterate an earlier comment in the chat. If you could please respond to our attendance survey if you haven't already. It'll just take a few minutes to help us make sure we capture you for future training sessions. If you need a code for logging this time in your timesheet, you can use your program's rulemaking activities code. It should end in the 43 extension. And the recording and the slide deck will be made available. We'll get them processed. Okay, so back to modified proposals. So as Nina mentioned, if there are no comments that need to be incorporated, no change to the reg text, you can proceed to the final rulemaking package. But if there are comments received that DTSC is considering, we have to consider how substantial and how related they might be. So if they're substantial and unrelated, as in we could not have predicted them prior to going to notice, but they're worthwhile for incorporating, we have to go out for a new 45-day notice. Most of the comments we receive tend to fall in this middle category of substantial and sufficiently related. So it's within the scope of that 45-day notice. It's really just kind of refining our proposal. We put that out for a 15-day comment period. And if some of the changes are really non-substantial, they're correcting typos, maybe it's a renumbering, there's a missing space, something like that, we don't have a comment for that. We just address it in the final package. Next slide, please. So when we talk about modified packages, there's typically 2 documents that are part of these packages. One is the notice. So it'll be a 15-day notice, and it explains how the proposal is changing. So it tends to be one of 2 things. Either we're adding information to the file or changing what information is available. So we have to document that in the notice to say new evidence, a new technical document, a new study, etc., is being added to the file. Or we're changing the reg text itself, in which case this package will also include the modified regulatory text. And what's important is because these are really the only two documents that make up a modified package, there's no statement of reasons to go along with it. The notice is where you document what the impacts of those changes are. So is changing the reg text changing reporting requirements? Is it changing reporting periods, for instance, or compliance periods, things of that nature? We want to be able to explain what that means to the regulated entities. And then the logistical information of that comment period. Next slide. So the modified reg text, as Nina mentioned earlier, when you have your 45-day notice, your initial reg text, it's done in single underline for additions and single strikeout for deletions. For the modified text, you're showing the change not to existing law, but the change to your proposal. So you use double underline for new additions in that 15-day comment period and double strikeout for deletions in that 15-day comment period. And this can get a little confusing because you might actually be taking out something that you had proposed to initially add. So that would take on both sets of formatting. You would see single underline from the initial text, then double strikeout because you're no longer proposing to add it. And then if you have subsequent 15-day comment periods, then we start adding bolding to the single underline or bolding to the double underlining and so on to show additional layers of edits. Next slide. So now that takes us to the final package. Next slide, please. So the final package is everything. Your final package is going to include everything that made up your notice package, all of your modified package or packages. It'll include now a final statement of reasons, your responses to all the comments, your Form 399 in its final glory, your final reg text, all these different things, and we'll walk through each of those. Next slide. So the final statement of reasons tends to not be as extensive as the initial statement of reasons. There's the first part of it that documents how your proposal has changed from the initial notice that started the APA process. So it'll walk through different things like, has your digest changed, documenting all that. Were there any changes to laws between the moment you started the APA process and now when you're closing it? And then it breaks down what are the substantive and non-substantive changes. Next slide, please. So it'll detail all the different comment periods you had. It'll include final determinations where the initial statement of reasons said DTSC initially determined that it had such and such impacts. Now, after having heard from the public, you make a final determination, whether or not those change or not. And then somewhat the more critical portion of an FSOR is the responses to comments section. And depending on how many comments you received, how complex your responses are, you can include it in the FSOR document itself, or it can be a separate document, but they go together. Next slide. So the responses to comments is our chance to say what we interpret the comment to be, what our response to that comment is, and then how the proposal changed or didn't change. So the responses to comments will include every detail about it. It'll index every comment letter as CL typically. If you receive testimony at a public hearing, it's often PH, and then it indexes it by who gave that comment and what their affiliation is. And it's important to remember that for every comment letter or testimony, there could be several comments within. So you might have one comment letter that has 1, 2, 3 comments in it, or a public hearing testimony has comment 1, comment 2, and so on. So all of those are broken down, and it's our obligation under the APA to respond to every single one. Next slide, please. Is there a question? Ryan, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, it's just about comments. Sometimes we get letters that don't really differentiate comments out, and they just kind of, it's one big block paragraph or a couple block paragraphs with multiple statements in them. How would you break those apart and respond in a fashion that would make sense, like for this type of document?
Great question. So there are a few different techniques to this. For the actual comment letter itself, you can highlight certain statements and then put a comment note or essentially annotate the letter, the PDF document, to say that is comment letter 1-1, and then highlight another portion, say this is comment letter 2, or sorry, comment letter 1, comment number 2 kind of thing. So it's visually represented, and then that is replicated in your index.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. So building off of that, in your SR, in your responses to comment, then you have to catalog everything. So not only are you indexing by name and affiliation and comment numbers, you're also delineating by which comment period or which hearing, if you have one, that you received that comment. And so you typically group it by those comment periods. And then within each comment period, you can group comments by like topic. You can have one topic where 6 different commenters made a similar type of remark, so you can group those and then respond to that categorical response or the category. You can also have individual responses. Maybe there are no like topics, and so you just take one at a time. And then finally, oftentimes a package will receive general support or general opposition. It's not really a comment on the material itself, but just inherently supporting or opposing it. And so those can be acknowledged separately too. Next slide. So other materials that fall into this final package are, if you had a hearing, you would include a transcript or a recording or minutes, some version of documenting that hearing. You would include every comment letter itself, so the actual PDF, and we ask that the file name corresponds to your index. It includes every document that you had cited in your ISOR and your NOPA, so the actual document itself, or at least a live link to it. And the Form 400. So where we start the initial APA process, the initial 45-day comment period includes the Form 400 as a submission to OAL. That is not signed. It just gives contact information. At this stage, now we're at the final proposal that we're saying DTSC is going forward with this rulemaking for OAL to consider. And at that point, that's when the director signs it. Next slide, please. So the final regulatory text at this point is now the net change of all your different comment periods. So if you only had your 45-day comment period and the reg text didn't change after that, your final reg text will look exactly the same. But if you had modified proposals that had that double strikeout, double underline, different layers of formatting, your final reg text will only show the very end product. So if you took out something you had initially proposed, that will no longer be there. So your final reg text is now, again, compared to existing law, the net change of all of those comment periods. Next slide, please. All right, you can, yeah, here we go. So at the final package stage, just like before when we had our review period through peer review, deputies, director, and agency, we repeat that whole process. And as Nina mentioned, now we have to submit our whole package to the Department of Finance for them to consider what's in the 399. Next slide. So when finance is looking at the whole package, they're looking at the reg text, they're looking at the initial statement of reasons, more for contextual awareness. But what they're really focusing on is the 399 and the assumptions made in that document. So they have determined they need 30 working days to review their reg pack or to review the entire package. This process is outlined in a couple of budget letters that they sent out. They've updated it recently over the last year. And all of that 30 working days, that 11 weeks of DTSC and agency review, all of that is prior to OAL submission. That has to occur within the 1-year clock. Next slide. And so as I mentioned, what finance is focusing on is the 399 itself. So they are looking at the underlying assumptions that we're making, the calculations, the story that we're telling to determine what's it going to cost to actually implement these regulations and who has to bear that cost. Are there any savings as a result of these regulations? So it's important and incumbent upon us to show our work in the attachment. The 399, as we've mentioned a few different times, is really more of a cover letter. There's not a lot of space to elaborate. We have to do more than say see attached, but we really have to show our work in an accompanying document. And so that's where they spend the bulk of their time. Next slide, please. Okay, index and certifications. This is the point where OLRR will add the final documents. So the index will work with the program to make sure that it includes all the different documents. This template has kind of the outer envelope of documents that you might need to include in your final package. So if they're not relevant to your package, say you didn't have a modified package or a 15-day comment period, you would take out that from the index, from that table of contents. But if you had multiple, you would add new lines for them. The key thing here is to make it easy for OAL to know what documents they're looking at in your package. So what you put in the index in that table of contents needs to closely match what you call that file. So if the 45-day notice is item 1, the file name should be O1 45-day notice. Pretty straightforward. So OLRR will also add the certifications that the package was mailed as required to potentially interested parties. There's a couple of these that correspond to the comment periods. And at the very end, this index includes a second page of a certification to say, this is the totality of the rulemaking proposal. This is everything that OAL is reviewing as the official record. This is what we want you to look at. And so we certify that that is true. Next slide, please. Okay, so add the certifications, submit it to OAL, and that closes the APA process. So now OAL's 30 working day review is outside of that 1-year clock, and it will result in a decision. Either they'll approve it, disapprove it, encourage us to withdraw it without actually saying those words. But if they approve it, then the regulations typically become effective quarterly. So I think one more click on this slide. If we are looking at a quarterly date, it has to account for OAL's 30-day review, and it has to account for the filing period with the Secretary of State. So it's typically about a month prior, gives you the period determining what your quarterly effective date is. So we are in March right now. So if we file a package between March 1st and May 31st, the effective date of that reg package would be July 1st. Next slide, please. So the rulemaking record, we keep using this term, official record, entire record, rulemaking package, and so on. The official rulemaking record includes everything from that 45-day notice to the final submission to OAL and OAL's approval memo. So all of that is what we keep forever, and is the thing that OAL wants to make sure is a strong administrative record of the rulemaking process, that it clearly states the reasons why we're adopting the regs the way that we are, those cost implications in the 399, because that is what's going to hold DTSC and the state accountable to its requirements. That is the thing that people are judging. Next slide, please. So administrative processes to support all of this, next slide, means there are several things kind of happening in parallel behind the scenes to the rulemaking package itself. So at the notice package stage on this top row, I need to mention we have this 10-day publication period. During that time, we're getting the documents ready to go live. So the program is finalizing the documents for posting so that they're remediated. We're working on the web page. We're spinning up the e-blasts and the mail out, all these different things. And coordinated with that is an optional outreach by the program. SAFER will typically do this by sending out a complimentary notice with the formal rulemaking 45-day notice, and also send a notice out to their stakeholder list. So that works. Similar happens during the modified package, except rather than waiting for a pre-publication period, as soon as we have approval from agency to move forward, or sorry, not agency, from the deputies to move forward, we can spin up all these different documents for posting and sending out. Final package, we wait until the Department of Finance approval. We've received everything back. We're getting ready to submit to OAL. We prepare the documents. And then after the regs are approved, we receive the approval memo. We post that to the final reg web pages. Everything gets updated, has a nice home in perpetuity. We can announce in coordination with the program staff that the regs are now in effect. And then, as Zena mentioned, when there's the CEQA document, that gets sent to the state clearinghouse, and we archive the package on the U drive. Next slide, please. Okay, one more slide, please. So as Nina mentioned, CEQA is a big deal. We are required by statute to do a CEQA analysis, but that happens in parallel with the rulemaking process. So as you get your rulemaking started, you're developing your packages, you're doing your analysis. It typically is a notice of exemption. And then you hang on to that document while you proceed through the rulemaking process. And it's DTSC's interpretation that once OAL approves the regulation, that's when it becomes a real project in terms of CEQA considerations. And at that point, we would submit the now branch chief or division chief signed document to the state clearinghouse. So just as another reiteration of this, the CEQA document itself, the CEQA analysis, the analysis is part of the rulemaking. The document itself is not. Next slide, please. And for external scientific peer review, so as a department under the Cal EPA, we are required to vet our rulemakings if they're based on science. And so we do this in coordination with the State Water Board. They run this program through a contract with UC Berkeley. This program takes about 2 months, 3 months, I think, is now more where they're at. So we have to factor that in. This is often done prior to your initial 45-day notice. It doesn't have to be, but it most often is. So that peer review process would not typically count towards your 1-year clock. And then the technical document that results is now considered document relied on and is actually part of your rulemaking record. So it's included in that period. Next slide, please. Okay, so just some quick updates. We're done talking about the rulemaking process, but there have been some updates to the regulations development dashboard. To initiate your peer review, when you are ready, you have your notice package ready to go, you have your modified package, your final package, whichever stage you're at, you need to upload it to these designated teams sites. These sites are set up so that all the different peer reviewers, deputies, assistant chief counsels, director, and so on already have access, so they're not being given continued access to new team sites. Everything is housed in these different channels, different sites. And now we have a new intake form that we are rolling out with this training. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So on the regs development dashboard, you have some quick links to the OLRR resources. So they're organized by folders. They will match more or less with what's on the internet site. There are several different training resources, including folders for this training series, a wait list to get onto CARB's training list, information about training with OAL, lots of different resources here. What's new in this section is this teal box for the routing request. This is the form that I just mentioned. When you're ready for peer review, you click on that link, provide the information that's there to get it started, and that will trigger that whole process. Next slide, please. Some additional updates. Now that we have this intake form for the routing process, we're able to share more information about where those packages live in that routing process. So including some information here. This is still kind of an evolving little segment on the dashboard, so it may change visually over time, but all the information will live here from when you first requested review, as it proceeds through the process, and if it's on time or delayed. So many apologies to all the packages that are in red right now. Now that we're using Smartsheet to track this information, we're able to get a better sense of how long each of these different stages take. I do want to note that recent direction has now told us to include governor's office review. We're still figuring out what that means and how that fits into this whole process, but from a prudent perspective, add 30 days to your timeline for the review process. So another 4 weeks on top of the 11 that follows agency review. So once we get some clarity on how that process goes, this section of the dashboard will be updated to include that as well. Next slide, please. And this is actually a carryover from the prior version of this dashboard. So you can see recent actions over the last quarter, more or less, where we've actually seen some updates. So MMA and nail products is our most recent activity. They just went through a 15-day comment period. They're working on their final package now. The other 3 were recently adopted. Next slide, please. And that takes us to our last slide, where it's a chance for any additional questions, reminders to work with all the different offices that are part of the rulemaking process, so financial planning, OLRR, and of course your attorneys in OLC. Lots of resources, the links to all the materials that we talked about here. So the intranet site, the dashboard itself, and then of course our public-facing web pages, where when you actually enter the rulemaking process, you see your documents live in the real world. And with that, we can go to Jill with the first question.
Sorry, I have a couple of quick questions. One, is there a style guide for what terms should be capitalized and whether acronyms should be used, that kind of thing, for the California Code of Regulations?
Yes, so one of the materials on the OLR intranet site is actually a set of 2 style guides. One is the California Style Manual 4th edition, which I understand attorneys rely on for all of your briefing materials, etc. We have an excerpt of that that gives a few examples of how to implement that in the regs space.
Okay. And then I have another question. When is a CEQA analysis required? If the reg doesn't have anything to do with any kind of building project, is CEQA still required?
Yes, so there is a provision in the in the Health and Safety Code that requires all Cali PA BDOs to do a CEQA analysis when they adopt regulations. So what we have in our notice, in the 45-day notice, is some template language to walk through different scenarios. And this is where we'd encourage you to work with the CEQA units to determine which is the most appropriate language to use. And essentially follows kind of a decision tree of, is this a project, yes or no? Use language if it's no. If it's yes, there's another subsequent question of, if it is a project, does it have XYZ impacts or not? So there's basically some blanket language there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's Blue. Is that you with your right hand? Oops, your hand raised?
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and post my feedback in the chat too, just in case, because I'm having technical issues. My 2 bits of feedback on this great presentation. I actually have 3 bits. One, on slide 10, you don't have consistent use of periods in your bullet, and that kind of continues through slide 14. So I would go through and check your use of punctuation. The other piece of feedback I had was you spoke rather quickly, and it was hard for me to consistently follow. So I would like take a breath and just slow down at like a half a beat. And then,
thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. And then I had a question about when we were doing the bill analysis, from the perspective of the people on the bill teams who help write some of these additional and supplemental documents. Is there guidance for the questions we should be asking while we're doing these analysis? Does that make sense? Like, what should we be looking for as we go through this bill in preparation of writing this document in the weeks upcoming?
When you refer to this document, do you mean the bill analysis document, or do you mean the subsequent regs that may result from one of the bills?
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant the bill analysis document.
I think, Eddie, if you're on the line, I don't know if you'd like to answer that question or if you'd like to take it offline.
Since this is related to regs, I'm not sure if if you're asking something specifically related to regs, but if it's about legislation, I'm happy to take that offline. And this training is separate from the legislative training that we delivered yesterday and the day before that. So let me know if it's specific to the reg stuff or the leg stuff.
It was a general question about those of us supporting you guys in writing regs and writing legislation. Like, I want to know how to best support you as somebody who's on these support teams.
See, so like with the regs, when we're determining, with the ledge stuff, if we're trying to determine fiscals, there's a list of questions or a checklist we provide you, right? Are you saying is there something similar here like that?
Yes, yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm asking.
And so I'm not sure if our folks have that at this point, but it's something we can definitely, if it's something that's, makes sense for the work here, we can discuss that, but I'll leave it up to Nina and Gabby to respond further if they need to.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
It's a really good question. I think I'm gonna have to think about it for a bit and come back to you maybe offline about it, because I'm trying to think. It's definitely a challenge. The legislature often takes for granted how long it takes to develop regulations, and so if a bill includes a mandate or an authority to adopt regulations to implement something they're doing, we try to help them to understand the amount of work that goes into those ultimate regs and the timeline that would be more realistic. But I think that's also hard to tell because so much of the bill language is vague or speculative. And so the amount of work that actually goes into developing regs, as many of the people on this call can attest to, is it grows, and it's more than maybe we could have estimated. So let me think about that and come back to you.
Yeah, that's great. And I wasn't trying to make more work. I was just trying to think if there was something that out there to help us support you guys. Where was it? So don't make anything new if you don't need it. I was just looking to be a better support.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I will review the slides before we post them to make sure that the punctuation is fixed.
Thank you.
And yes, I do talk very fast, so the note is well taken. I'm going to answer a couple of questions that were in the chat just to be able to say them out loud. So yes, often generally 18 months for rulemaking packages to be developed. It really depends on the program, the package itself, many different variables. Since the CEQA NOE is signed after the final package is approved, does OLR still route it? No, we rely on program to say your reg package has been approved. Here's the record. Here's a copy for your, viewing pleasure. Now you proceed. That's part of the implementation phase. So you within program would route your CEQA notice according to the CEQA requirements. And then where did the pre-APA review timelines come? A lot of it is based on experience. So if you work closely with OLRR, financial planning, and legal to develop your packages from the early stages, peer review could be faster. But if we're seeing it for the first time, then we're learning the material at the same time as trying to review it. And so the peer review will take, a month or so. For director and deputy reviews, 2 weeks is consistent with a lot of different reviews that they do for other work products. So we try to be consistent with that. Cali PA has determined they want 3 weeks to review any work product. Regs are no exception. And then the GO review, right now we're going off the assumption of 30 days based on what they've told us. But again, we're still figuring out what that means. No, there's no CEQA unit within OLRR. I believe there's one in site mitigation and one in permitting. And so those would be the 2 units that you would be working with for your rulemakings. Alexa, I see your question on what happens if OAL doesn't approve the package. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I wanted to answer a couple more questions. Megan.
Howdy. I have a question. It's kind of in the same line as Alexa's, I feel like, but my experience with the review process was there was like some back and forth dialogue, like you get feedback and then you sort of like make your edits through the process. Is that the same once you submit to like DOF and OAL, or are they like go, no go, and it's like they're either gonna sign it or they're not?
They would love to sign our packages, and they are generally very accommodating and helpful to ensure the best possible outcome for the package. So if they don't care what the policy is, they care that we've complied with the different requirements. Finance cares that we're being mindful of the cost implications. But within each of their different review periods, there's an iterative kind of back and forth. It tends to be towards the end of each reviews because they're processing their own workload. But we ask that the project teams stay available during those 30-day review periods because you're the subject matter experts. And so if finance has questions or OAL has questions that can be addressed during the review, we want to be able to do that. And then I'll use that as a segue. Tricia, could you go to the next slide? Oh, it's hidden. Sorry. Give me a moment. I can unhide it, and then if you could reshare your screen. Okay, go ahead and go to the last slide and reshare. Okay, so yes, if it's looking like even after this iterative process of talking with OAL, and they're like, package still has some issues, doesn't apply, then we can talk about what a disapproval looks like. So OAL can approve and disapprove all or parts of a package. And so we've seen this in a few different iterations where an entire package gets disapproved or portions of it get disapproved, or we can choose to withdraw the package from consideration and there's essentially no action on it. So if OAL is going to disapprove a package or a portion of it, then we would look internally within DTSC at what resolutions we have. And so that can take, some amount of time. And we would look at saying, okay, if we're going to make whatever conditions OAL has described and they have a disapproval memo that actually outlines all these different things, maybe something was disapproved because it did not meet the clarity standard, or it was disapproved because we did not clearly describe the necessity of it. So going back to those 6 standards that we talked about in the first training, they will outline every possible reason why the different provisions were disapproved. And so as we go through and we figure out if we can address them, we have to decide, does it require a comment period? And this is going to look a lot like the 15-day modified period. Go through that same sort of decision tree that you see on the screen here of if it requires a comment period, you public notice those provisions, you consider the comments, rinse and repeat until you get to the point where no further comment periods are necessary, and you resubmit those disapproved provisions that have since been resolved. Still has to go through our approval processes with peer review, deputy, yada, yada, all the way up to agency. And all of that now has to be done in 4 months. So it's more focused because it's the disapproved portions of it that you're trying to fix. But that disapproval process, that 4-month window, means you don't have to restart everything from day 0 of the APA 1-year clock. You're just focusing on fixing what needs fixing. Now, through all of that, discussions with OAL, again, they like to provide guidance through this disapproval process. If through all that, it's still looking like, we can't do what OAL is telling us needs to be done, we can choose to withdraw the package. And so we've seen this in a few different instances over the last 10 years or so, where OAL will meet with us and say everything except we encourage you to withdraw this package. They'll find like all the different words to use other than those, but heavily implying very clearly, make no mistake, that they will disapprove it if we proceed. So it's a choice. There are pros and cons to going with the withdrawal route. There are pros and cons to going with the disapproval route. They each have their merits. And there's really no bad outcome either way. It's a choice that we make within the management structure on what's the best course of action. Any other questions? Hearing none, seeing none. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We can be found at the regs email, at any of our individual emails. Feel free to reach out. The next trainings have not been announced yet, but we'll look at schedules. So again, if you could respond to that attendance survey to let us know your interest, we'll try to find the best time that works for the most people. And just like the first training, this recording will be posted and the slides will be posted as well. We just have to process them. Thanks, everyone.
And hold on.
Oh, yes,
Gabby,
Nina.
there was a question from Megan. The 4-month period after a year. Megan, can you clarify what is that question about? Sorry, we didn't answer that.
Yeah, you said if if your package is denied, then there's a 4-month process. That denial would be like after the 1-year clock, correct?
Correct.
Well, obviously,
And then the
yes.
4 months would be like immediately after that 1 year.
Yeah, the 4 months is from the
Okay.
date of OAL disapproval.
Okay. Hoping that doesn't happen. Just curious.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's good to know.
Yeah.
With all of these different scenarios, we don't have a lot of experience. Fortunately, DTSC doesn't have a huge history of disapprovals or even withdrawals. Again, that I think that is a testament to all the work that goes into developing the packages and then working with finance and OAL during their reviews. But each time we have to approach one of those, then we consult with OAL in the process so that we're all working from the same information about how to proceed successfully. All right, any other questions? If you withdraw, how much time should be left in the 1-year APA clock? So I'm going to break apart this question a little bit. So at any point after you start the APA process, you can choose to not proceed with your rulemaking. And it's just, you send a note to OAL and they put, I think, a notice in the California Regulatory Notice Register saying we've chosen not to proceed with the rulemaking. If we've submitted the rulemaking package to OAL, that has closed the APA clock, that 1-year clock, so it's no longer ticking. And that withdrawal consideration is now in that 30-day window of OAL reviewing that happens after the clock. So that withdrawal decision is time bound within that 30-day window. All right, any other questions? All right, I think we can stop the recording and close the meeting. Thanks, everyone.